For the last few Revos, we've been looking at sin and misery, this sad state that all of mankind is in. And with today's catechism, we're going to look at what God does about that state and how He brings us out of that state. So look with me at question 20. Did God leave all mankind to perish in the state of sin and misery? Answer: God, having out of His mere good pleasure from all eternity elected some to everlasting life, did enter into a covenant of grace to deliver them out of the state of sin and misery and to bring them into a state of salvation by a Redeemer. So again, we're looking at how did God save us from the state of sin and misery, and we'll unpack that answer by answering these 5 classic questions. First, we'll start with what did God do? The Bible teaches us that God chose some in order to bring them out of sin and misery into everlasting life. This act of God choosing some is a doctrine that's known as election. It's a biblical doctrine, a hard doctrine, but it's there in the Bible, so we must deal with it. And when did God make this choice of electing, of choosing some unto everlasting life? Or where did He make this decision from? The Bible teaches us that He made it from all eternity. We remember from a previous catechism that we learned about God's eternality, that He is not only before all things, but He is even outside of time. So this decision that He made to save some was made before the world was even created. He made this decision before all time. This is why the doctrine of election is also sometimes referred to as predestination. Predestination, it is God determining a destination for those that He chose, and He's doing this before that destination is reached. So this is a decision made before it actually happens, predestination. Who now did God elect? Well, the Bible is clear. Some. Not all. He only elected, He only chose some. Which leads us to ask the question, why? Why only some? Is it because God has a particular preference for them? Is it because God knows the past and the future, and He knows what decisions everybody is going to eventually make for Him, so He chose them first? What is the basis? What are the conditions upon which God chose these few select people, some people? And the answer, as the Catechism and Scripture teaches us, is that why did He choose some? Out of His mere good pleasure. He chose some simply because He chose some. That is the grace of God, and that is as far as we can take it. He chose some out of His mere good pleasure, out of His grace. And of course, when we think about that, we ask the question, is that fair? It doesn't seem fair that God would only choose some and not choose others. But again, if God was to be fair, if we wanted God to be fair, then what would have to happen to every single person? Well, He would leave us in our state of sin and misery and bring upon us the just condemnation and punishment that we deserve. That would be God being fair. So the fact that God chose some is an expression, is an example of His grace, His mercy, His goodness. This is why when we talk about election and predestination, we have to handle this topic with great care, but we have to handle it nonetheless because it is biblical. It is there throughout the teaching of the Old and the New Testament. And the final question is, how did God do all this? How did God deliver us? He did it by entering into a covenant of grace by which we were delivered out of sin and delivered into salvation. So as we learned in previous catechism, there was at first a covenant of works. And you remember that covenant, that man should be perfectly obedient to God's law in order to bring them into a state of everlasting life. That covenant was made with the covenant representative, Adam. And because Adam failed, that cast Adam and all his generations to come from him, all his children, to cast them into the state of sin and misery, as we've been talking about. So what did God do? God had to enter into a new covenant with mankind. And this is a covenant that's identified as a covenant of grace. Who would be the representative? Who would be the head of this new covenant? Who would be one that was worthy, that was able to actually fulfill all of God's law? Well, it would be this Redeemer. It would be another Adam, a second Adam. And by that second Adam's victory and accomplishing of all the works, it would bring all of mankind, all of those who are in that Redeemer, it would bring them into the state of salvation. Colossians 1, verses 13 and 14 highlights this beautiful redemptive truth. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of His beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Do you struggle with the doctrine of election and predestination? Or what are some ways that you have struggled with this? What are some questions that you've asked of this? Now consider, the teaching is here in the Bible for a reason. And the reason, as we see it being used by Paul, the reason is to not confuse believers, not to cause controversy, but the reason is primarily to encourage believers, to give believers assurance, to give them hope, to remind them in whose hands their salvation really is, to remind them who's in control. So that is your parting reflection for this time, that you would think about this doctrine of election and think about how it brings you even more confidence and security in God and in Jesus Christ, who is our Redeemer.